So today I got a budget gaming PC build featuring the Intel Core Intel? In a budget build? Let me see that build list. Intel. In a budget build. Hey guys, welcome to Elevated Systems. I'm your host CJ, and last week I took a trip up to Micro Center to get some components for a budget gaming system, and what I came back with may or may not surprise you. It surprised me because truthfully, I didn't intend to come home with this Intel Core i3-9100F. But the few Intel CPUs just look so sad, all crammed into the side of the little display case. A case that just over a year ago they dominated, but is now dominated by Ryzen CPUs. So after seeing build guide after build guide featuring AMD CPUs, as AMD has deservedly moved from the budget option to the CPU of choice for most new PC builds, I decided I'd do a budget build featuring an Intel CPU. Oh, how the tables have turned. So let's talk about the build real quick, and since it's the first gaming PC I've built on my channel, I'll take a little time to talk about my philosophy when it comes to PC building. Let's start with budget and expectations. In my short time as a system integrator, the vast majority, I'd say nearly 80% of customers, were looking to spend between $600 and $800 on a system for 1080p gaming. So for this system, I'm targeting a budget of $750. And while the focus will be 1080p gaming, with some of the newer graphic card choices we have, we should be able to build a system within our budget that's also capable of some good 1440p gaming. That brings me to component selection. Usually with a gaming PC, I'd start with the GPU and build the system around that. However, in this case, I started with the CPU. So that will influence my GPU selection in a couple of ways. The first is price point. As a rule of thumb, I typically assign half of my budget to the GPU, as the graphic cards, without exception, contributes the most to gaming performance. And the second variable is the computing power of my CPU, which in this case is a 4-core, 4-thread i3. And while I think the days of 4-core gaming PCs are coming to an end, if not already ended, and the target now for budget systems should be 6-core, 12-thread CPUs, especially as new games are taking advantage of hyperthreading, I'm hoping the higher clock speed and higher IPC of the 9100F will get the job done. The fact that it turbos to 4.2 gigahertz should help, which I'm pretty sure this is the first and only Core i3 that has turbo boost. All games can take advantage of higher clock speeds and higher IPC. So just for anybody watching unfamiliar with those terms, IPC, or instructions per cycle, refers to the number of instructions a CPU can process, or the number of calculations it can perform in a single clock cycle. The clock speed is the number of cycles each core can complete in a single second. In the case of this CPU, it can perform up to 4.2 billion cycles in a second per core. So a CPU's processing power is really its IPC times its clock speeds. This is where AMD was lacking in its early efforts, especially at the low end. They released cost-effective CPUs that offered frequency boost and even hyperthreading, but the IPC was significantly lower than what Intel could achieve, so they fell behind in gaming. I think they have pretty much corrected that by now though. Anyway, enough with the tech talk. Well, no, I guess tech talk is what I do. I guess less in the weeds tech talk, and I'll continue to just, talk about the tech. So for the GPU, I have a $350 budget, and I didn't want to go too powerful where the CPU starts to become a major bottleneck in modern AAA titles at 1080p, so I went with the RX 5700 non-XT, and I selected the Gigabyte Gaming OC model. For a few reasons. First, price. It came in at $350 after a $10 rebate. Second, this card is identical to its 5700 XT big brother, with the exception of 256 stream processors being disabled, and the card's BIOS, which set its clock speeds and power limits lower. So, while I can't enable cores, I can flash the 5700 XT BIOS and give this card a significant overclock. But that's in a future video, so make sure you get subscribed for that. For this build, I think the card at its out-of-the-box settings will work good with the 9100F. Now on to the rest of the build. I also picked up the motherboard at Micro Center because, well, that's why you go to Micro Center, for the bundle deals. So I got this Gigabyte ultra durable B365M DS3H micro ATX motherboard. Regularly $74, but I got $20 off with the bundle deal. No need for anything fancier as we're using a 4-core 65-watt locked CPU. For memory, I'm using a 16 gigabyte kit of Corsair Vengeance LPX memory. For storage, I'm using a 256 gigabyte Sabrent Rocket NVMe M.2 SSD as my boot drive, and a 1 terabyte Western Digital Blue HHD for my storage drive. The PSU for this build comes with a caveat in that the PSU I'm using is different from what is on the build list. I'm recommending the EVGA 600 BQ as a good price to performance PSU for this build. I'm using this Corsair CX750M because, well, it's what I have on hand. Remember guys, at this beginning point of my channel, everything you see was bought and paid for out of my pocket. I don't make a dime from YouTube or anyone else yet, so I have 2 PSUs I use for system testing. This is one of them, and I can keep $54 in my wallet. But in reality, this PSU won't affect performance at all over the 600 watt EVGA PSU, which is even more than needed for this hardware. And finally, the case I was going to use was this Lee LANCool 2. Because, well, it's a great case with a ton of cool features, but because the cost of some of these components has gone up since I planned the build, and not everyone has access to a Micro Center, even at its affordable $90 price point, it may push me over budget. So this case will be used in a future build. You may see the start of that build right over here. It's not really a budget build. Well, I mean, it is a budget build, just a bigger budget. What was that? Another plug for a future video? Have you subscribed yet? Hey, at least I'm not trying to sell you my underwear. So now the case I am using is this SAMA-3D Mid-Tower ATX case. I've never built in this case. In fact, I just did a Newegg search for a $50 to $60 ATX case and looked for one on the list that hit all the requirements, such as mesh fronts, included fans, top ventilation, adequate room for cable management, drive trays, and this one actually has a tempered glass side rather than the expected acrylic. But let's see what it's like to building. So, that's everything. I guess there's nothing left to do but cue the music and start building. So that's it. The build came together pretty well. No major issues. Maybe I'll do a full case review on this SAMA-3D. Let me know in the comments below if that's something you'd be interested in. But as far as a few build notes, I did make a couple of modifications to the case. First, I added an additional 120mm fan to the rear of the case, just for some added exhaust. My plan was actually to move one of the front fans to the rear, but I wanted to keep the build, pretty for you guys. It's probably not even needed, but I had a spare fan, and you can pick one of these case fans up for about $5, so I'll just add that $5 to the build price. I also removed the foam filter on the back side of the front panel, again just to improve airflow. I did stick a cheap 12-volt LED strip in there, but that's solely for filming purposes, so you guys can see inside the build with the glass panel on. That brings me to my last point before we get into some performance numbers. When I build a budget system like this, I make an effort to squeeze every bit of performance from every dollar I spend. That's why I'm using the ugly Intel box cooler, because it came with the CPU and it works. I've had Heaven on a loop now for a while, and the CP's only at 50 degrees. I could always add an inexpensive aftermarket cooler like this Cooler Master 212 Evo, but that's $40 out of the budget and it contributes zero to performance. $50 is a good price point for a case to hold $700 worth of components. Other than the snazzy fixed LED fans that came with the case, there's no fancy RGB stuff. I mean, there's nothing wrong with RGB. In fact, this build over here is gonna have a bunch of RGB, but that's like a $2,000 build. So $100 in RGB stuff isn't a big deal. $100 in this build could mean an upgrade to like an i5 9600KF. Where would you rather put your money? Anyway, let's skip ahead in time several hours and put up some benchmarks.
Thermal performance and power efficiency of the system were quite impressive. After a 20-minute simultaneous run of both AIDA64 and FurMark, maximum CPU and GPU temps and max power draw were very low. Synthetic gaming benchmarks resulted in typical scores for both TimeSpy and Firestrike. A total of 10 games were benchmarked. Forza, Breakpoint, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and World War Z results are from integrated benchmarks, and 1 and 0.1% lows were not acquired. All games tested were able to maintain average frame rates well above 60 FPS. Two outliers here are Control and Ghost Recon Breakpoint, which I don't believe are completely optimized for the RX 5700, considering the lower frame rates despite max percentage of GPU use never exceeding the mid-80s. Additionally, based on the significant fall off in 0.1% lows, you can see that the Intel i3-9100F was slowing frame times on occasion. However, I found gameplay very smooth and didn't notice any significant stutters, latency, or frame drops.
Overall, I think the system handled pretty well for both 1080p for competitive gaming where higher FPS is needed, and more casual 1440p gaming. There were a few titles that did max all 4 cores of the 9100K, which resulted in some elevated frame times and some 1% and 0.1% dips in frame rates. But overall, if you're an Intel fan and are looking to build a system in the $700 to $800 price range, this is a good option. Additionally, if you have a slightly tighter budget and don't care about 1440p, you can trade out that RX 5700 for a cheaper card like a GTX 1660, an RX 5500, or even an RX 590, which you can even find for about $100 on the used market. Overall conclusion, good price to performance system. And that does it for this one, guys. I hope you learned something. That's always my goal. If you liked what you saw here, please hit that thumbs up button. And the best way to support a small channel like mine is by subscribing. So until next time, have a great week.